Good evening. My name is Straun Stevenson. I am a member of the Iranian American community of Northern California. I want to welcome all of you for coming in tonight. Before we start, I have a request that you put your cell phones on mute or vibrate or whichever. The topic of tonight is a topic that it is of interest to Iranians as well as Americans. It talks about rise of ISIS in Iraq and the central role that Mullah's regime had played in this in the happening. It also talks about, we're going to talk about the human rights violations and the massacre that has happened in Iran, and the movement has begun in bringing the people that have been responsible for this to justice. These are several topics. We have the privilege to have somebody that is uniquely qualified to speak on this topics. Massacre Stevenson, apart from all the other work that he has done in European Union, in the Parliament, European Parliament. I don't want to go through all his public work that he has done in many, many different areas. The specific area that it is very, very relevant to the topic of discussion of tonight was he was the president of the delegation of the European Parliament to have for relationships with Iraq, and in that capacity he had observed and witnessed and analyzed what has happened, what went on in Iraq that led to the rise of ISIS, and he has an insight into what has taken place. So we are very, very glad to have him with us. Before I give the mic to Mr. Stevenson, I just wanted to remind people that he has chronicled his experience not only with the Iranian resistance, about the topic, just the topic that we just went over, but it is this book has in it testimonials from the members of the resistance and how they have suffered the human rights violations and where it comes, and how he himself has joined this movement. I have not had a chance to finish the book, but the few pages that I've read, it is one of those books that you don't want to set it down until you finish it. Very well written, and so this is out there after you had a chance. I'm sure Mr. Stevenson will talk more about that. With that, I just wanted to invite Mr. Stevenson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shaheen, and thanks so much to the Iranian American community for inviting me to come back to the States. I was just saying to some people today, last time I was in San Francisco, my wife and I rented some bikes down in Fisherman's Wharf, cycled over the Golden Gate Bridge down to Sausalito, and had a wonderful lunch there. And I said, after that, I'm not cycling back up that hill, we've got to get the ferry. So it's great to be back. It's a beautiful place. I'm sorry that I've brought the rain with me, but everyone tells me you love having the rain here. We enjoy when the rain stops in Scotland. So welcome this evening. As Shaheen was saying, and thanks for your kind words, I was a member of the European Parliament for 15 years, for 3 mandates. And it was in the first year I was in the European Parliament that I was regularly being visited by the Iranian ambassador. And he came on one occasion to a pre-arranged meeting in my office in Brussels. And I had just read a report about the execution of a 14-year-old girl in Iran. She'd been raped by an IRGC official. He was reprimanded. She was sentenced to death. She tore her veil off in the court in astonishment at this brutal sentence. And the judge said, for abusing his court by taking her veil off, he would take her outside and put the rope around her neck. When I read that, my blood turned cold. And when the Iranian ambassador came to my office, I said to him, he started giving me the usual propaganda about the great things that the Islamic Republic of Iran had achieved. And I said, Ambassador, just stop right there. Your regime has just hanged a 14-year-old girl. This is an act of such depravity, such an abuse of human rights. I never want to have you crossing the threshold into my office again. I'm going to ask my staff now to show you out. Do not try to come back to see me ever again. And I can assure you now, I will dedicate the rest of my career in politics to try to bring down your evil regime that you represent. And I picked up the phone and I telephoned one of the NCRI representatives, one of the MEK representatives who I had met several times in the Parliament in Brussels. And I said, you've been speaking to me once or twice asking if I could come and help. Now I'm volunteering my assistance. What do you want me to do? And ever since then I've been very much involved. I could say that phone call kind of changed my life because I have not been let off the hook since that day. I come from Scotland. I see a few faces in the audience who were in Sacramento last night when I was telling this anecdote, but I live in the southwest coast of Scotland, and it's an area famous for its rock formations. Geologists come from all over the world. They find samples of fossils there, which the only other place in the world where similar fossils can be found is in the Appalachian Mountains on the eastern seaboard in America. And they have deduced from that 480 million years ago there was a chain reaction of volcanoes which tore Scotland off the American continent and rammed us up against England, where we've remained rather uneasily ever since. And but for that trick of geology, of volcanic eruptions, we would have been the 51st state and may have been a little happier than we are now, but I don't know. I've been looking at your politics since I got here. We have political problems in Scotland as well. I want to talk tonight about the experience I had as first of all, 15 years of working with the MEK, but also in the final mandate when I served as president of the European Parliament's Delegation for Relations with Iraq and had to go frequently to Baghdad, to Erbil, and to many other countries in the Middle East. Not to Iran, I have to say, because I wouldn't be here tonight speaking to you if I'd gone to Iran. But it became very quickly apparent to me how in the West we appear to be spellbound by the Iranian regime. The UN, the EU, certainly the US, we appear to get it wrong every time. We back the wrong people every time. I recall after the elections in Iraq when Ayad Alawi, the secular leader, who although he's a Shia, he was talking about having a government of national unity. But Tehran said, we have a red line against Ayad Alawi. We cannot permit him to become the prime minister in Iraq. even although he won the election by a majority of 2 seats. And Iran, the mullahs said to America, they said to Europe, we demand that you help us to ensure that Nouri al-Maliki is made the Prime Minister of Iraq. Nouri al-Maliki then managed to build together a coalition with the help of Tehran, with the help of the regime. They instructed the Hakim party, who had won a number of seats in the Majlis in Baghdad. The Hakim party, although an Iraqi party, their headquarters is in Tehran. They instructed Muqtada al-Sadr, the anti-American whose Sadrist soldiers were responsible for many American deaths during the occupation. They instructed him and his members of parliament to support Nouri al-Maliki. And they built together this coalition that took control, made Nouri al-Maliki as a puppet of the Iranian regime, made him the Prime Minister of Iraq, and then started to manipulate him, ordering him to open a passageway through Iraq to enable soldiers, material, to get to Bashar al-Assad in Syria, to bolster his fight against the Syrian opposition. They then started manipulating Maliki to insist that he smash down on the Sunnis. They said, get rid of all the Sunnis that are in your cabinet. Even the Vice President of Iraq, Tariq al-Hashemi, who wrote the constitution for the new independent Iraq after the occupation, a great humanitarian. They arrested, Maliki arrested his 12 bodyguards. One of them was tortured to death. Amnesty International said that when his body was returned to his parents, they could not recognize their own son because of the brutality of torture that he had suffered. And based on his tortured confessions, Maliki charged Tariq al-Hashemi, the Vice President of Iraq, with terrorist charges. And he fled, first of all, to Kurdistan and then to Turkey, where he still lives. And in absentia was sentenced to death 5 times. This was all because of pressure from Tehran. He then tried to arrest his Sunni finance minister and murdered the finance minister's brother in front of his wife and family in the attempt to arrest the Sunni finance minister. And of course, an uprising started in the Sunni areas of Iraq, in Fallujah, Ramadi, Mosul, Al-Anbar province. And the Sunnis were rising up in protest. How could this happen? Their own prime minister allowing this murderous genocide against the Sunni members of his parliament, of his government. And with the instructions from Tehran, Maliki started waging a civil war against his own Sunni population, shooting them down. And a murderous campaign of genocide began, again aided and abetted and instructed by the mullahs in Tehran. And this simply opened the door for ISIS to come flooding in from Syria. This was the genesis of the ISIS catastrophe, where they quickly seized 1/3 of the geographic territory of the whole of Iraq, seizing control of cities like Fallujah and Ramadi, and the second biggest city in the whole of Iraq, Mosul. And of course, the next thing we see is the mullahs in Tehran say, okay, we will join now in the fight against ISIS. And they are sponsoring over 100 Shia militias who are led by General Qasem Soleimani, himself a listed terrorist, the commander-in-chief of the Quds Force, the Jerusalem Force, who carry out external terrorist operations on behalf of the Iranian regime. The IRGC is listed internationally as a terrorist force. The Quds Force is listed. General Qasem Soleimani is listed as a terrorist. He is boasting about his presence in Iraq, commanding these Shia militias. And under the pretext that they are fighting to get rid of ISIS from Iraqi territory, they have started their own genocidal ethnic cleansing campaign of the Sunni population in Al-Anbar. They have left two of the great ancient cities of Iraq, Fallujah and Ramadi, as smoking ruins, where the men, after the ISIS forces were driven out, the men were separated from the women and children, and men, even boys of 14, 15, 16 years of age, were marched off by the Shia militias, and many of them have never been seen again. They are now beginning to discover mass graves around these cities. So is it a wonder now that the forces of the Shia militias are surrounding Mosul, where over 1.5 million Sunnis still are trapped there by ISIS? Is it a wonder that we are all nervous about what may happen, and that these people in Mosul think the same thing may happen to us as happened to our brothers and sisters in Fallujah and Ramadi? This sort of genocidal campaign, this could be the future for Mosul. It could be reduced to rubble as part of the ethnic cleansing, which has been the ultimate objective of the Iranian regime. And you know, we have to wonder why it is that America, Europe, the UN has sat back and allowed this to happen. Only this week, Erdogan, the president of Turkey, has taken action against Haider al-Abadi, the prime minister in Iraq, saying to him, we are not prepared to watch the annihilation of our Sunni brothers and sisters in Mosul. We're not prepared to see a repeat of what happened in Fallujah and Ramadi. And Haider al-Abadi has reacted angrily, saying, how dare you send Turkish troops into my country, into Iraq? And Muqtada al-Sadr has now said that he is prepared to start shooting Turkish troops. These are the people that are supposed to be on the same side, defending and repatriating the great city of Mosul from ISIS. And now they are talking about shooting each other. This is becoming an absolute catastrophe. And meanwhile, over the border in Syria, with the so-called fight to get rid of ISIS in Syria, we have seen not only the involvement for 6 years now of the Mullah regime, of the Iranian regime, who have now sent 70,000 troops to fight in Syria. 70,000. Tens of thousands of them Afghans who had fled as refugees to Iran, who were without any means of sustaining their families, and who have been sent as cannon fodder to Syria on the promise that if they are killed, their families will be given full Iranian citizenship and a pension. And many thousands of them are being killed, I can assure you. And because Iran has now welcomed the intervention of Vladimir Putin, we now have the escalation of the Russians becoming involved in this zone of conflict. And they claim that together with Iran, they are trying to bomb and carry out airstrikes against ISIS. In fact, they are doing exactly the opposite. They are attacking the moderate opposition, who we in the West should have been backing from day one to oust the bloody regime of Bashar al-Assad. And we are now witnessing on a day-by-day basis the bombing and the horror of children, women, Even people in hospitals, hospital patients, being blown up by barrel bombs, being attacked by chemical weapons, and we in the West sit back and watch. In Europe, we wonder why tens of thousands of people risk their lives trying to cross the Mediterranean, thousands of them drowning in the process, fleeing from this horrific conflict. We have a migration crisis of biblical proportions. Is it a wonder? There are 20 countries now involved in bombing Aleppo. If there were 20 countries bombing San Francisco, you would all be trying to come to Europe as well. I mean, this is not a surprise that any of this is happening. And the regime who thrives on exporting terror and exporting conflict around the whole zone, that regime is Iran. They back Bashar al-Assad and his murderous regime. They back the Shia militias with money, with personnel, with even their commander, General Soleimani, in Iraq. They back the Houthi rebels in Yemen. They back Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're the ones financing all of this growing cancerous malignancy in the Middle East. And only this week, after all the concessions that we have given them, that the Americans, that Obama's administration has given the Iranian regime with the crazy nuclear deal. I'll say more about that in a minute. But after all the concessions, bending over backwards to give them even more concessions, lifting even more sanctions than were called for by the nuclear deal, what do the Americans get in return? They get the American Navy in the Gulf of Aden attacked by missiles, Iranian missiles fired from Yemen by the Iranian-backed Houthi rebels. Only this week, and for the first time now, the American Navy has fired back. Yesterday they decided enough is enough, we're not going to stand for this, and they've fired back. So almost you could say now we are seeing the beginning of a proxy war, at long last, of America fighting back, saying we are not going to sit back and watch you attacking our naval destroyers in the Gulf of Aden. And Iran has now said they will send 2 of their warships into the Gulf of Aden to confront the American Navy. So we are seeing this escalation, this potential flashpoint, which all could have been avoided if the West had only been more robust. But instead of that, and I think the only reason for this nuclear deal was because Obama, having achieved a deal with Cuba, decided that was not enough for his legacy as his term in office comes to an end, decided he wanted a bigger historic legacy. And that's why he instructed John Kerry to spend 6 solid weeks in Vienna when there were crises all around the world that required the Secretary of State's attention. For 6 weeks he was told to remain in Vienna until he got a deal that Obama could sign, giving all kinds of concessions. I've read the whole deal, about 120 pages of it, and about 100 of those pages deal with the lifting of sanctions on specific areas benefiting Iran, and very few of these pages deal with cutting back on the nuclear program. And I would remind everyone in here, who was it discovered the nuclear conspiracy in Iran? The Western intelligence agencies completely missed it. It was the MEK back in 2002, at complete risk to their life and limb. MEK supporters in Iran discovered the nuclear conspiracy, told the West at a press conference in Washington, D.C. And what thanks did the MEK get for that from the West? They found themselves being put on the terror blacklist in America, in Europe, in Britain, They were listed as terrorists based on propaganda that had been manufactured by the mullahs in Tehran. A ludicrous state of affairs. And it took us years of expensive and complex legal battles, not only in Washington, in Paris, in London, in Luxembourg, going through endless court cases until we had the completely unjustified terror tag lifted from the MEK. But that was the appeasement policy that the West was following. Anything the mullahs said, we want Nouri al-Maliki as Prime Minister in Iraq, we refuse Ayad Alawi, we demand that the MEK become listed as terrorists. Anything they asked for, the West agreed to. Maliki then proceeded to become the godfather gangster of all politicians, of all leaders in the Middle East. There was a report given to the Parliament in Baghdad last December by the Committee of Integrity, who had been investigating corruption by Maliki and his vast team of ministers. And this report accused Maliki and his government of having stolen $500 billion. This is industrial, absolutely industrial looting, corruption on a scale that the world has never before witnessed. $500 billion. That's not me making that up. It's not from a newspaper report. It's from a committee of integrity who had investigated this corruption in Iraq. And yet this gangster was supported for 2 terms in office by America, by Europe, and by even the United Nations. But then we decided in the West that this wasn't enough appeasement. We had to give them the nuclear deal. The concessions, the lifting of sanctions, released $150 billion in money that had previously been sanctioned, in assets that belonged to the Iranian regime that had been frozen for years under the sanctions. This was released to them. The citizens in that beleaguered nation, 80 million Iranians, thought, well, at last we may see some relief from the poverty we're suffering from the economic downturn. Not a chance. That money has been channeled into the export of terror, which is still and always will be the main export of this evil regime in Tehran. That money has been channeled into Syria, into Hezbollah, into the Shia militias, and the situation inside Iran has not improved at all. The economic situation is worse. But this was a regime that was teetering on the edge of economic collapse, and the nuclear deal gave them a windfall, propped them up, gave them enough money to start buying more weapons, to export more terror in the zone. What a crazy and what a big mistake, what a catastrophe. How could the West possibly do that? We're dealing, ladies and gentlemen, with a regime which believes that the misogyny, that the desecration of women, that the abuse of human rights, of women's rights, that the public execution, almost on a daily basis, of even teenagers, even people of 15, 16 years of age, that the gouging of eyes, the flogging in public, the stoning to death of women who have been accused of adultery, the amputation of limbs, this medieval barbarity continues on a day-by-day basis to brutalize and terrorize the people of Iran into meek submission. And yet we in the West think that we should be doing business with this regime. We think that Rouhani, because he smiles to the camera, he must be a moderate. All the press we read around the world oh, this wonderful new moderate president after the dreadful Ahmadinejad. We have this moderate, smiling Rouhani. I tell you now that since Rouhani came to power, 3,000 people have been executed. This is capital punishment on an unprecedented scale. Per capita, Iran now executes more people than any other country in the world. More than China. More even than North Korea, as far as we know. According to Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the abuse of human rights inside Iran now has reached gigantic proportions. And in August this year, we discovered a new horrific piece of evidence. We've known for a long time, for decades, that thousands and thousands of MEK simply disappeared. We knew that they had been executed, that they had met a horrible end. No one knew, not even their families, where they were buried. No one had been told to come and see their loved ones before they were executed. No one had been informed that they'd been sentenced to death. It was all rumor and supposition, but we knew that tens of thousands had gone. And then in August this year, the son of Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, who had been the designated successor of Ayatollah Khomeini, the man who founded the Islamic Republic of Iran after the revolution in 1979. His designated successor and second in command, the second senior politician in that whole country after the revolution, Grand Ayatollah Montazeri, his son released an audio tape in August this year where you can hear the voice of Montazeri, the Grand Ayatollah, reprimanding, almost shouting in disbelief and anger at 3 people who had been appointed by Khomeini as a death committee responsible for carrying out his fatwa to massacre all of the people who remain steadfast in their support for the Mojahedin, for the MEK. In a fatwa of July 1988, Khomeini had said, I want anyone in prison just now accused of crimes of supporting the MEK, I want them taken before a special 3-man tribunal, and I want these tribunals set up in every town and city in Iran, and I want them to be asked a single question: are you still in steadfast support of the munafiqin, the horrible word for hypocrites that the regime refers to the MEK? And if these people even use the word Mojahedin or Mojahedin Khalq in their response, immediately they're sentenced to death. Now the 3 people set up under this fatwa as the death committee to supervise the annihilation of the MEK, you can hear in this audio tape with Montazeri shouting at them, how is it possible you're taking people who were sentenced already by our judicial system to 2 years, 5 years, 10 years in prison, and suddenly you take them out and hang them? That makes a fool of our whole judicial process. How is it possible that you're hanging pregnant women? How is it possible people who have served their sentence and already been released from prison are being brought back into the prison and then hanged? And we now have discovered from evidence given by security guards who were involved in that annihilation and who were so appalled at what they were being asked to do that they defected to the West. From them we know that they were working in 1988 from August until the end of that year, from 8 in the morning till 8 every evening, They had batches of up to 20 cranes in the courtyard of Evin prison and other prisons throughout Iran. And in batches of 20, they were hanging the Mojahedin, the MEK. They were taking them in front of the Sharia judge. Do you remain steadfast in your support for the MEK? If they said yes, they were marched out and hanged, and the next batch were brought in. This is an unbelievable brutality. It is the worst abuse of human rights, I think, since the end of World War II. I recall reading many books and seeing many films about, during World War II, about the horrific massacre of the Polish intelligentsia by the Russians, by the Soviets, in Katyn Forest, where 23,000 Polish officers and school teachers and professors and academics were executed on the orders of Stalin and the Politburo. And since the evidence of that came to light, there has been an international outcry, endless books and movies made about this horrific event. But what has happened 28 years after the same horrific 30,000 people barbarically killed in this way inside Iran? What has happened? What has the West done? We've remained silent, as always. We seem to think that a regime like this, with the smiling moderate leader Rouhani, is a regime with whom we can do business. Well, you know, on the audio tape, the guy who you can hear protesting against Grand Ayatollah Montasiri's reprimand is a guy called Mustafa Pur Mohammadi. He was the man in charge of the death committee. He was the man who was responsible for ordering the annihilation of the 30,000 Mojahedin. He is now the justice minister in Rouhani's government. The other two members of that death committee are both in senior positions in the administration in Iran. And yet we believe in the West we should be doing business deals with these people. We believe we should be opening the commercial floodgates. That after the nuclear agreement, everything is fine, you know, we should be welcoming negotiation and dialogue with this moderate regime. This, ladies and gentlemen, is beyond belief. This is beyond the pale. Surely carved on the Liberty Bell in this great country is the words about human rights. It's written into the Constitution of America. I'm not saying here, please start speaking to your political leaders, to your congressmen and senators, and demanding that they go to war with the Iranian regime. But I am saying, for heaven's sake, don't do any commercial deals with this bloodthirsty, barbaric, murderous regime without insisting on adherence to civilized behavior and decent human rights. Surely that is the least we can ask for. And I'll tell you, it will never happen, because the minute we start putting a clause about human rights into any commercial contract, that barbaric regime will run a mile. They can't allow the slightest crack in the facade of oppression. Otherwise, the people of Iran will rise up and throw them out and get rid of the evil, theocratic, fascist regime that runs that country. And that's why it's so important that we press for human rights in every forward deal that we negotiate with that country from henceforth. You know, we had, when I started supporting the Mojahedin, with 3,500 of our brothers and sisters trapped in Camp Ashraf in Iraq. After the American occupation ended and the American military left, and we handed over control to the Iraqis, under Nouri al-Maliki. With the direct instructions of Tehran, he of course immediately began a horrific, oppressive siege of Camp Ashraf. There were 3 brutal massacres where armed battalions moved in on these unarmed civilians in that camp, shooting them down, running them over with military vehicles. There were repeated rocket attacks. There were abductions. There was a constant siege, even a medical siege, where people suffering from injuries caused by some of these attacks, people suffering from cancer, were denied access to proper medical treatment. In the 8 years that the siege continued, we saw the people from Ashraf moved to so-called Camp Liberty near Baghdad airport, and even under Haider al-Abadi, the new prime minister in Iraq, we still saw repeated rocket attacks. There was one last October where 80 rockets were fired into the camp. And yet, despite all of our pleas, when I came again and again to Washington, to the United Nations in New York, again and again I was in Paris and Geneva, and going to the capitals of the world, pleading with governments to try to rescue these people, get them out to places of safety, because Tehran is telling their marionettes, their puppets in Baghdad, to massacre them all, to annihilate every one of them. But my pleas and the pleas of all of us were falling on deaf ears. And only little Albania, a country of only 1.5 million population, but a country that suffered under decades of communist oppression, and they know what it's like to fight for freedom. They have big hearts in Albania, and they said, we'll stand up to the plate, we'll stand up and be counted, we will help rescue these people. And only 3 weeks ago we got the last plane load of people from Camp Liberty evacuated and sent to Tirana. During these years, 1 or 2 have gone to various countries in Europe. As far as I'm aware, none were rescued by America at all. But at the end of the day, John Kerry went to Tirana because of the pressure from all of you, the constant pressure which we put on the American administration and the European Union. Finally, John Kerry went to Tirana and agreed that there would be some compensation given to the Albanian government if they helped. And this, I can tell you, has made the mullahs in Tehran as mad as hell. Only 2 weeks before the last plane load left, we understand now from intelligence inside Baghdad, the security forces stopped an articulated truck carrying a missile launcher, trying to make its way to within a mile of the camp perimeter. This again would be financed by the Iranian regime. They wanted another massacre. They wanted to annihilate these people. They had a list drawn up of the leadership of the MEK in Camp Liberty, and they were demanding that the Iraqis should arrest them all and deport them back to Iran, where they would have faced certain torture and execution. So what a victory, what a relief that all of them are now safe. All of them are in Albania, and we really have to be very grateful to that country. So ladies and gentlemen, in the 15 years I have been involved, we've struggled to win the battle over delisting the MEK and the NCRI from the terrorist list in America and Europe. We won the battle now, only in the last month, to take all of these remaining refugees from Camp Liberty to a place of safety. These are huge victories which show the weakness of the Iranian regime. I believe now that it is in a weaker and more fragile state. It's bleeding to death in Syria. If Bashar al-Assad is allowed to fall, it will be the death blow for the regime in Tehran. And I have to say to you, when they pretend to the world that they are joining with us in the fight against ISIS, the godfather of ISIS was Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Iranian regime. He claims, we are Shia and ISIS are Sunni, and you can't therefore say that we have any fraternity with these people at all. But of course this is a lie. We all know that during the Soviet time, the Communist Party was split into many different factions across the world. The Trotskyists, the Leninists, the Marxists. They were fighting internally with each other, but they all looked to Moscow as the mother of the communist movement. And Islamic fundamentalists, no matter whether they're Shia, Sunni, or whatever they are, all look to Tehran. That is the modern day beginning of Islamic fundamentalism. That started with Khomeini and has been continued now viciously with Khamenei. And believe me, the same way as the collapse of the Soviet Union led to the virtual disappearance of all these communist sects around the world, there are one or two rump parties that are ridiculous that are left. The same will happen if we see the collapse of this evil regime in Tehran. You will see the gradual dissolution of the jihadist, fundamentalist Islamic movement, no matter what sect they come from. So now that we have achieved these great victories over Camp Liberty, Camp Ashraf and the Blacklist, all of our attention now can be focused on the main objective of all people who want to see freedom, democracy, women's rights, human rights, an end to torture, an end to the death penalty, an end to the nuclear threat. All people who want that kind of free future for Iran can focus their attention on achieving regime change in Tehran. And the opposition, the most significant, the most well-organized, the best equipped opposition to achieve this objective is certainly, in my view, the MEK. Mrs. Maryam Rajavi, she is a formidable leader. Here we have an organization led by women, largely led and organized by women. This sends shivers down the spine of the misogynist, fascist theocrats in Tehran. This is a movement which can get 100,000 people to their annual rallies in Paris. 100,000 Iranian expats, all of whom have extended families inside Iran. I keep hearing from people in the regime, they say the MEK is simply a grouplet. It's an insignificant, irritating little grouplet. Isn't it strange in that case, the uproar that was caused only last week when Sharif University of Technology inadvertently published a magazine with photographs of all of its graduates over the last few decades. And they included in one page a picture of Mrs. Rajavi. And there was uproar with the regime saying, "How dare you publish this?" They closed down the university magazine immediately. 30 members of parliament of the Majlis in Tehran walked out protesting that this had been allowed to happen, screaming that Mrs. Rajavi is the #1 enemy of our regime. So suddenly this little unimportant grouplet that nobody fears is suddenly the #1 enemy of the regime. Well, that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I am so proud to back the MEK and the NCRI. And that's why I'm so proud to work with all of you It's your involvement. It's your petitions, your letters, your protests. I've been in many protests outside the White House, in Berlin, in Paris, in London, in Geneva, where we've joined forces together. And we've got the attention now of senior politicians, senior political figures around the world. We can use all of that energy now, all of that fight and determination to campaign for justice and freedom, for a decent future for the people in Iran. Thank you once again for inviting me here, and I'm perfectly happy now to answer questions. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I will start with a question of mine. Can you maybe elaborate a little more? I know you have talked as a humanitarian, a person that deeply regards human rights based on your conviction. But I want to ask you a question as a European politician, as a European parliamentarian. What is at stake here for Europe and Western world to see this regime gone? And if you can elaborate on that a little bit more, that would be great.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. If we allow this regime to continue on its present course, and of course, as I said, the nuclear deal and the windfall of $150 billion of unfrozen assets has certainly been helpful to them in keeping them from falling over the economic cliff. If we allow them to continue, they will continue their main export of terror in Yemen, backing the Houthi rebels, in Lebanon with Hezbollah, the Shia militias in Iraq. They are gradually, reducing the Sunni population of Iraq to a rump. That's their key objective. They didn't manage it when the Iraqi-Iranian war took place. Now they're achieving it by different means with the help of the West. We are providing airstrikes to back the Shia militias in their attacks previously on Fallujah and Ramadi and now in Mosul. I mean, for us to be backing this regime in their efforts to annihilate the Sunni population, no wonder the Sunnis sometimes feel that they are safer backing ISIS than allowing themselves to be massacred by the Shia militias. So, the malignancy of this oppressive regime, if we allow this to spread, I would remind you that in the Iranian constitution, their key objective is to create a worldwide caliphate. Isn't it strange that that happens to be one of the key objectives of ISIS as well? The creation of a caliphate. So again, it points to the fact that the Tehran regime, the mullahs, are the godfathers of this whole jihadist movement. Getting rid of them will bring peace to the Middle East. I'm absolutely convinced of that. And the first stage in that process must surely be backing the moderate opposition in Syria and bringing down the bloody regime of Bashar al-Assad. That would be a death blow to the mullahs and would start the process of their dissolution. But every time there has been any kind of uprising in the streets of Iranian cities, we close our eyes in the West. We saw after the second fraudulent re-election of Ahmadinejad, when tens of thousands of students, of young people, took to the streets in protest, and they were shot down. They were shot down, rounded up, arrested. Students were hanged publicly often for being part of that uprising. And we in the West, who had supported the Tunisians and the Egyptians, perhaps mistakenly, after the Arab Spring, we sat back and allowed this to happen. And now we seem to think it's more important that we sell Boeing aircraft or we sell technology to the Iranian regime under the lifting of sanctions. This is a catastrophe. This must not be allowed to happen. We must hammer home human rights is more important than money. Human rights comes first before commercial success. Yeah.
I have sort of a two-part question, I guess, they're related. One is, I know it's hypothetical, but can you kind of give a scenario of Iran that had a nuclear weapon and how that would change the dynamics of the area? And then number two, related to that, is we're led to believe that Iran was within months of achieving at least the material to make such weapons. Do you think that was true or just part of the game?
I can tell you that the Israeli cabinet, this is on their agenda every weekly cabinet meeting. I don't think America would have to do anything if Israel decides that there is a danger that Iran is on the verge of producing a nuclear weapon. Israel will take action, and you will have the most horrendous conflict erupting in the Middle East. And that would draw in the rest of us for sure. They were about 5 years away from producing a nuclear weapon. Now, with the nuclear deal, they're about 10 years away. So it has made very little difference. And in any case, they're cheating already. They have already test-fired some ground-to-air missiles in direct breach of the nuclear agreement that was signed. Direct breach. In fact, one of the missiles that was test-fired, I think it was in August this year, written on the side in Farsi was "Death to Israel," and it was fired
in Hebrew.
In Hebrew, and it was fired on the day Joe Biden happened to be visiting Jerusalem. So these things are done with a purpose. They're done because the regime wants to send a message to America, you know, we duped you into signing this deal, and look how strong we still are, and you're still trying to appease us. And you know, we seem to think that if we can sell commercial goods, if we can buy oil from Iran, that this overcomes all problems, and we never mention human rights. Well, I'm afraid that is not acceptable, and it should not be acceptable to anyone in the Western world today.
We'll have a follow-up question to this. There's many, this is a political season right now in America, and there's a skittishness toward any involvement that the West or U.S. will have in that region of the world. Can you, I mean, both from the Iranian resistance point of view, and you've been supporting that thing, what is the alternative? What is the, because you're talking about one is the appeasement, and you've talked eloquently on how that is not working, okay? Is the war on the other side of it is what we have seen in Middle East, in Iraq, and right now in Syria. What is the alternative? What is the way out of this sort of a dilemma?
Well, no one can argue that had Iran not interfered, not meddled in Syria, I think the Syrian population would have resolved their civil war themselves. Many years ago, probably. The meddling of Iran has kept that civil war going for 6 years, has sucked in the Russians now, with Vladimir Putin's involvement, who in the summer announced that he had established a Russian air base on Iranian territory, unbelievably, and only last week the Russian defense minister announced that he's creating a permanent naval base, Russian naval base, in Syria on the Mediterranean. So, you know, the lack of involvement by the Obama administration, and believe me, I should stop saying believe me, because there's another famous politician that keeps saying that just but the lack of any involvement in the Middle East by this current administration in America, in Europe, the Europeans watch what America does, and the Europeans follow suit. Although the left wing in the European Parliament, where I was, are always pretending that they're anti-American. In fact, if American says jump, Europe says how high, every time. So the lack of any boots on the ground, if you like, from the American military has been faithfully followed by the Europeans. And of course, when we have started giving air cover and backing the Saudi coalition battling against the Houthi rebels in Yemen, we see very little about support for the Saudi coalition in the press, but whenever a horrible mistake takes place and a funeral in Yemen was inadvertently attacked by one of the Saudi coalition aircraft, there is a complete outcry around the whole Western press. The Western media go crazy, blaming Saudi Arabia. But you hear nothing about the atrocities that are being committed. What about this atrocity? Why are we not hearing our politicians hammering the desk about this? So, you know, I said earlier in my presentation, I'm not calling for an armed invasion of Iran. Simply backing the legitimate opposition instead of always putting hurdles in their way. Why are we not inviting Mrs. Rajavi to come to Washington, D.C., to come to San Francisco, to speak to everybody over here? Why are we still treating them as if they were still on the terror list? These are the people that would bring democracy back to this beleaguered nation. So we don't need boots on the ground, but we do in Syria. We need to have a no-fly zone to protect the civilian population of Aleppo. We're going to watch the absolute annihilation of men, women and children. Civilian, innocent, unarmed civilians are being wiped out on a daily basis. And it's again because of our complete lack of interest and lack of involvement. And in the current presidential campaign, I don't hear either side saying, you know, we're going to try to intercede and try and stop this horror story escalating. Both sides seem to be pursuing a policy of isolationism. That is going to come home to haunt all of us. ISIS simply, you know, they suck the blood of appeasement. And they will be the ones that take greatest advantage of that. And that will come home to visit all of us, even here in America. Yeah.
It seems to me that the only real resistance to ISIS and the Shia
Militias.
Government of Iraq was the Peshmerga and the Kurdish group. And I haven't heard you say anything about Kurdistan and the Kurdish resistance to Iraq and their actually successful war against ISIS.
The question is about Kurdistan and the Peshmerga and the great fight that the Peshmerga have put up. They've been one of the biggest stalwarts in battling ISIS. And yet we have given them very little assistance. I've been to Kurdistan many times. I've met with President Masoud Barzani on many occasions. And I hold him in higher regard, I have to tell you, than Hyder al-Abadi or certainly his predecessor, Nouri al-Maliki. But the Kurds are also using this situation for achieving some of their own objectives. They long coveted the city of Kirkuk and its rich oil fields, which Saddam had so-called Arabized by moving the Kurds out and moving Arabs in. And the Kurds now, after Kirkuk was occupied by ISIS, the Peshmerga quickly moved in, defeated ISIS, drove them out of Kirkuk, and they have seized control of Kirkuk and its surrounding oil fields, and believe me, they will never give them up again. that will become part of the KRG territory, the Kurdish Regional Government Territory. But they are also threatening to hold a referendum after the American presidential elections, so possibly in December this year, on independence. In fact, every time I spoke to Masoud Barzani, he was asking me, you know, why can't we have a peaceful referendum the same as you had in Scotland? And I said, listen, don't speak to me about this. I believe that an independent Kurdistan's a good idea. I don't believe an independent Scotland's a good idea. But if Kurdistan votes for independence, and believe me, it will be a 99% vote in favor of independence, that is going to pour petrol on the flames, because there are vast enclaves of Kurds in Iran, in Syria, in Turkey, and the Turks have their own war going on against the PKK. So, you know, I said on many occasions to Masoud Barzani, independence will come one day, but for heaven's sake, don't do it now. It would be a dangerous time even to hold a referendum. Wait until the dust settles, wait until we've resolved the situation of ISIS, wait until we hopefully see regime change in Iran and a democracy reintroduced there. That is the time to start negotiating for a free Kurdish state, but not now. But we should be arming the Kurds with modern weaponry. They're the brave people who are fighting and putting up a great fight against ISIS. But we're ignoring them at our cost. Yep.
Mr. Stevenson, in the world history, European history, the Munich Agreement in Europe didn't stop Hitler from his aggression and doing all the things that set Europe in play. Now, this appeasement of Western countries, especially the US, toward the Iranian regime, as you mentioned in your speech, didn't slow down the Iranian regime for its interference in all over the Middle East. And we see what people of Syria are suffering these days. Now we hear that even Chinese are going to join Russia involving airstrike and so forth. The topic of no-fly zone has been discussed many times. Here, Obama draws so many times red lines for chemical and so forth, and never any action. Now we have an election here, and that topic was even discussed in the second debate. And I was astounded that to hear Donald Trump was saying, cooperating with Russia and Putin is not a bad idea. Maybe we can join to fight ISIS. Putin is bombarding, Aleppo, and that what kind of cooperation would be, it amazes me what this man is saying. So my question is, what's your viewpoint in situation in the Middle East, especially Syria, and as it's escalating to a worse condition? Do you see maybe a World War III coming our way if this trend of appeasement continues the same way it happened in Europe 7 years ago?
The question for anyone that couldn't hear was relating back to the appeasement policy of Neville Chamberlain and the Munich Agreement, where he flew back after a meeting with Hitler and waved a bit of paper when he got off the plane in London to say, peace in our time, I've struck a deal with Hitler. But it was an appeasement policy which ended with World War II and the conflagration that engulfed the whole world. The question is, can the appeasement policy we are pursuing now in the Middle East, with the conflagration in Aleppo and Syria, could that potentially lead to World War III? I certainly hope not, but I tell you, if we allow the Iranian regime to build nuclear weapons, as I said earlier, Israel will never stand for that. And there would be an immediate, possibly nuclear attack, an exchange of nuclear weapons between Iran and Israel. And that, of course, would suck in the rest of the world. So once again we see ourselves on the brink of a potential disaster. It really goes back to the Cuban crisis, the missile crisis. We are confronting something of that magnitude. And that's why I think it's so important that we've got to get our politics sorted. The situation politically now in the world is catastrophic. You know, a lot of people have said to me here, you know, we are having such a horrible presidential election campaign, but the situation in the UK at the present time, where we've just voted by a majority in a referendum to leave the EU, that's a tragedy. And really, you know, politics is in terrible upheaval everywhere. We need proper leadership, and we need people who will stand up to the bullies and the oppressors of the world. Otherwise, the bullies and oppressors like Hitler will be victorious. And there is no question in my mind that people like Rouhani, who we think we can shake hands and do business deals with, you know, he was deputy commander-in-chief of the Iranian military in 1988 when the fatwa and the massacre, the annihilation took place. He was well aware of everything that happened. And he has to be held to account, and Mustafa Pur Mohammadi, his justice minister, and all the other perpetrators of that massacre. They need to be indicted for crimes against humanity and brought to The Hague to face justice in front of the international courts. It is ludicrous that we think we can continue to do business with them. And once the world stands up and agrees that appeasement no longer is an acceptable policy, and we want to stand up and be counted and fight back against these bullies, then we will see a better future. But the alternative is too horrible to contemplate. The alternative could see the world sucked into another world conflagration. Any other points? Everyone's stunned into silence. Well, what's... yep.
Does Masoud Barzani receive any financial aid from Iran?
Oh, from Iran? No way. No way. Nor does he receive any financial aid from Iraq, although he is the president of the Kurdish regional government. Iraq, Haider al-Abadi and his predecessors have fought with him about, they claimed he was stealing their oil and that the deal to share oil revenues was being ignored. But Iran is not giving him assistance either. He is always at loggerheads with the Iranian regime because the Iranians are so frightened that their Kurds will join him with any campaign for an independent Kurdistan. You know, last time I spoke to him, he said to me, your former Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, he was the guy that drew the lines on the map that caused the problems that have continued to this day. He said Churchill's biggest problem was he never learned how to draw a circle, he just drew straight lines. And I said, well, I've read Churchill's volumes of autobiography, and he himself said that his biggest mistake in his life was not creating, when he drew the new map of the Middle East, was not creating an independent Kurdistan. And it will come back to haunt him. But the Kurds, in my view, are the people we should be backing in the fight against ISIS, not the Shia militias. We should be demanding the Shia militias are disbanded, that the interference of Iran inside Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East should be ended, that the Iranians should be sent back to Iran and told not to meddle in these neighboring countries. And we should demand that Haider al-Abadi, if he wants aid from the West, that he does it in response to providing good governance and an end to the rampant corruption. Corruption that means that Baghdad has 4 hours of electricity a day, that very few people in Iraq have access to clean drinking water, that the sewage system has broken down for years, And yet this is a country that is oil rich. That during the years when oil was selling at $120 a barrel, they were pulling in billions of dollars every year, and it was simply being stolen by their corrupt political leaders. And that money is now being used to finance the 100 militias. They're paid by money that was stolen from the Iraqi people. That's where the Shia militias are financed from. That money is finding its way into the civil war in Syria. We've really got to wake up in the West, and we could help, we could put things right if we backed the opposition in Syria, if we backed the biggest opposition, Mrs. Rajavi and the NCRI, MEK in Iran. And if we allowed the people of Iraq to elect a properly democratically elected government, a secular government of national unity. But we ignore all of that because oil is more important, commercial business is more important than human rights. Yep.
میتونید ترجمه کنید من با اروپا به خاطر بعض سازش‌هاش اصلا خیلی اروپا کارایی میکنه یا اعمالی انجام میده که خودش این گادفادر تروریست رو پشت پرده نگه میداره و عوضش میان به جای گادفادرش رو بزرگش بکنه هم میان داعش رو یا گروه‌های تروریستی دیگر رو در سازیات روی تبلیغات رو روی اینا میزنن. چرا اروپا اینقدر نسبت به این مسئله کوتاهی میکنه و اصل تروریسم رو نمیره؟
So the question is regard to appeasement policy as it pertains to European politics. And you said much about the fact that the Iranian regime is a godfather of ISIS. Yet, what we see both in Europe and here in the United States is that this is marginalized. This fact is marginalized. And instead, all we hear is the Sunnis and the extremism that is coming from them and ISIS in particular. What's behind this thing and why is that?
I was asked this question last night in Sacramento about what's behind the misinformation campaign that leads everyone who studies the mainstream media in the West to believe that, you know, the big problem is ISIS and that the Iranian regime are our natural allies in fighting against ISIS. Well, in fact, that is a misconstruction that was perpetrated by none other than the great, powerful lobbyist in the White House, a guy called Ben Rose, who some of you may have heard of. I read a long article in the New York Times this summer talking about how he has become one of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., and how he set out with a purposeful, designed campaign to tell the media, who he describes privately as all sort of teenagers who are easily manipulated. He set out with a purposeful campaign to tell them that we are dealing with a moderate leader and there is great hope for dialogue with the Iranian regime and the nuclear agreement is a great idea. And then when several pallet loads of gold bars, dollars, bundles of tens of millions of dollars and Swiss francs were seen being loaded onto an aircraft to fly to Tehran, after which several American hostages were released. And we were in the West appalled at this news and saying to the White House, come on, you always said you would never pay for the release of hostages because that simply encourages evil regimes like the Iranian regime to capture more people, to hold more people. demanding more ransom. And Ben Rose then held various press conferences saying, oh no, this is all untrue. This money was actually money we owed the regime because of a deal we struck with the Shah of Iran before the revolution. I mean, that is laughable that someone can try to tell the press that, but they all wrote about it. They all said on CNN, I saw the reporter say, oh no, it wasn't paying for the release of hostages. No, no, no. This was a legitimate debt that we owed the Shah of Iran. You know, it's incredible that we allow ourselves to be fooled by this kind of nonsense. There's another word for it, but it's too rude a word for me to use this evening. But it's something to do with bulls.
All right.
First of all, I really enjoyed your speech and all of the points you made. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here and have your presence in Northern California. It's an honor for us. So thank you for that. The point I had was my question in regards to the 1988 massacre of political prisoners. This is a scar on every Iranian's heart. It hits home. It's really painful for all Iranians, regardless of their political beliefs. Now, as an Iranian or as an Iranian American who lives here, what can we do to bring the, all those who are accountable for this crime to justice? And bringing them to justice, what does it mean? Like legally, on a legal standpoint, if we have, we know Mrs. Rajabi has started a movement to put these criminals on trial. Now, can you explain, would you please explain what is the process so that, it opens up and we know better what's going on in that case?
The question is about how do we bring the perpetrators of this horrific massacre to justice. Well, one of the reasons that I'm over here for the next 16 days, I'm going on Monday to Washington, D.C. for a series of meetings with political leaders. Then at the end of next week, Thursday and Friday, I'm going to New York for meetings with ambassadors in the United Nations. Every year in the UN Security Council, there is a resolution on Iran, and it has to be supported by a majority of the countries that are members of the United Nations. This year, the sponsor of the Iranian resolution is Canada. So I'm also going to Ottawa to speak in the Parliament in 10 days' time, and then to Toronto to speak to politicians there. We've got to get a mention, at least a sentence, inserted in the Iranian resolution this year. Now, I was in Geneva 3 weeks ago speaking to the Canadian ambassador at the United Nations in Geneva, and she is responsible now for this resolution. And I said to her, this information has just come out in August this year from this audio tape. We cannot allow the Security Council resolution on Iran, which will be debated in November, we can't allow that to go past without mentioning this massacre, or literally the mullahs will believe they've got away with murder yet again. And she said, but the trouble is the resolution, the draft, began its passage of circulating all the member states back in February, and it's difficult now introducing new information. Why didn't you bring this information to me in February? And I said, because the information only appeared in August with the release of this audio tape, which incidentally has led to the son of Grand Ayatollah Montasiri being repeatedly 5 times now interviewed by the religious police, and it looks like he's going to be sentenced with an act of treason and possibly executed as a result of this. His father, by the way, the designated successor to Ayatollah Khomeini, because of his protests at that meeting heard in the audio tape, he was sentenced to house arrest for the rest of his life until he died in 2009 and was removed from the succession to Khomeini, which is why we ended up with the current Khamenei, the religious dictator who is now in charge of Iran. To have people who are responsible for a massacre of this magnitude not being held to account is just not acceptable to civilized behavior anywhere in the world. And that's why we have to have the Security Council mention this. Now, next year's resolution could have a whole page about this. This year, I understand the difficulty of new information, but we have to have at least a sentence. And that's what I'm working on. Now, I know there is a resolution similarly going through Congress here, the House of Representatives. Please speak to your political representatives and tell them they've got to support that. We have to put the pressure on now. This cannot be forgotten. Just because it happened 28 years ago, don't let people say, oh, it's historic, it's something that happened in the past. The people who have blood on their hands are in power right now in Iran. They are the ones that have to be held to account. We ignore this, then we can forget any support for human rights. We can tear up the American Constitution. Yeah.
I'm following up the same question. There is any option to go to the international court, or if it is, then when is a good time for that?
Well, I mean, bringing people before the International Court in The Hague is the ultimate objective. And we've done that successfully with dictators who believed they could get away with, literally with murder. There are many of them now serving life sentences in prison in The Hague. So I don't give up hope. And I always send this message. I remember when the foreign minister from Iran came to address the European Parliament. And as he was coming down the corridor, followed by a complete convoy of cameramen from the Iranian regime's news media, together with half a dozen colleagues, I stepped out in front of him and I said, you are a murderer and you are not welcome in our parliament. We don't like murderers coming into our parliament. And some of his, in the European Parliament, some of his bodyguards grabbed me and tried to drag me away. And I said, take your hands off me. You don't come here and treat me the way you treat your own people in Iran. How dare you lay your hands on an elected member of this House? Go back to Iran and wait for your downfall, and we will see you in the international courts in The Hague. And later that week, I was going into the lift in the European Parliament to go up to my office on the 15th floor, and the only other person in the lift was the Under-Secretary from the Iranian embassy. And he said to me, you were a bit hard on the foreign minister from my country the other day. And I said, why? He is a murderer. He deserves to be brought before the international courts. And we then rode up in silence for the rest of the journey in the lift. So, you know, I don't believe that it's impossible to bring these people to justice. That must be all of our objectives. But we've a long way to travel before we achieve that. And it's all of your help we're going to need to get there. Yep.
I have a question, and I have a different question about the fate of the Middle East countries. What do you think about the change of the Middle East countries? What do you think about the fate of the changing the Middle East countries?
Are you referring, I'm being asked what I think about the change in the Middle East countries. Are you referring to the Arab Spring? To the change in governments brought about by the so-called Arab Spring.
But there is something that somebody tells about the changing the countries in the Middle East, and they would be smaller. What do you think as a politician?
Oh, I'm
Oh, okay. So, I'm sorry, let me explain
Yeah.
that. He just came from Iran 3 weeks ago, so he, he has a different view, maybe, from many of us. But his question is that what do you think about making Middle East a smaller Middle East, like creating little countries? What is your vision on that? What is your intuition on that?
Well, I know inside Iraq there are many people that are now saying Iraq will split inevitably into 3 different countries. You'll have a Shia enclave, a Sunni enclave, and a Kurdish enclave. I honestly don't see that as resolving the situation. We need people now. This is why I'm so appalled at the referendum in Britain that will tear Britain out of the European Union. We need people working together in this world today. We don't want to be dividing nations. We don't want to be dividing communities. We don't want to be building walls, should I say, without becoming political in this particular environment. But, I don't think the answer. Someone last night in Sacramento from Aleppo said to me, "Do you see a future for Syria dividing into 3? That's not a solution at all. There was a lady last night in the meeting in Sacramento from Sarajevo. She had lived through the horror of the Bosnian War. And I've been to Sarajevo many times. And I remember vividly being shown in the middle of Sarajevo a church, a mosque, and a synagogue side by side. And the people there of different faiths, of different ethnicities, they worked together, they prayed together, they lived together, they even intermarried. And it was a harmonious society until the breakdown of the Yugoslavian Republic and the civil war that occurred. So dividing people is really not the answer. Uniting people is the answer, and people should be united in a peaceful way. That's what Mrs. Rajavi is offering the people of Iran. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm getting to one more question, and that will suffice.
Regarding to Saudi Arabia, if Iran, they feel so much pressure from Saudi Arabia, there is a chance they work together in future? Because Iran back up, and they realize it's dangerous, and then they start having, another, pressure, a lot of pressure from that area.
The biggest enemies right now in the Middle East, apart from Israel, the biggest enemies are between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And I was amazed this year in the huge rally of the MEK NCRI in Paris when Prince Turki Al Faisal Al Saud from Saudi Arabia, clearly with the specific permission of the King of Saudi Arabia, came to that great rally and said not only did he support the NCRI, but he supported regime change in Iran. So these are arch enemies, and it's time, honestly, that Saudi Arabia should stand up and be counted. I don't hold any candle for the Saudis. Their human rights record is not good. On the other hand, I'm not going to criticize Saudi Arabia. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much.